Tsar Alexander III tightened his grip on power with each passing year. In St. Petersburg, even two people walking side by side in the street could attract the suspicion of the secret police. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that a new group of students emerged, young idealists who sought to continue the violent legacy of Narodnaya Volya. Like their predecessors, they believed that only the death of the Tsar could destroy autocracy and spark revolution. On the 6th anniversary of Alexander II's assassination, 1887, they planned to avenge his killers by striking again, this time at his son, Alexander III. But the plot unraveled before it began. The secret police, the Okhrana, intercepted a suspicious letter and traced it back to the conspirators. When officers raided their safe house, they found bombs ready for use and arrested the entire group. Among the captured was a young man from a respectable family, Alexander Ulyanov, a brilliant student and the pride of his parents. During interrogation, Ulyanov refused to plead for mercy, declaring that it would betray his principles. Convicted of conspiring to murder the Tsar, he was hanged in May 1887 at the Schlisselburg fortress. The execution plunged his family into grief, but none were affected more deeply than his younger brother, Vladimir Ulyanov. Vladimir watched his brother die in the name of revolution. From that day forward, he began to dream of finishing what Alexander had started. Years later, the world would know him by another name, Lenin. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander III, hardened by his father's assassination, ruled with vengeance in his heart. From the first days of his reign, he sealed the door on reform. The very mention of his father's liberal policies, such as the emancipation of the serfs, was forbidden. To praise them was to risk arrest. The Tsar's fury was only inflamed by a letter he received from Narodnaya Volya shortly after his coronation. The group declared that it would abandon terror only if the Tsar granted a constitution and political freedoms. Alexander's response was uncompromising. In a public manifesto, he proclaimed that any challenge to autocracy would be punished by death. A sweeping purge followed. Every liberal official who had served under his father was dismissed, replaced by hardline conservatives loyal to the doctrine of absolute monarchy. Among the most influential was his former tutor, Konstantin Petrovich Pobedonossev, now the procurator of the Holy Synod, the spiritual overseer of the empire. A devout reactionary, Pobedonossev saw liberalism as a mortal disease. Amid our hardships, he once wrote to the Tsar, "The voice of God commands us to seize power with our own hands." Under his guidance, Russia entered an era of suffocating conservatism. In his 1883 letter to the Tsar, Pobedonossev lamented that there were still Russians who spoke of constitutions, parliaments, and the separation of powers. Such ideas, he warned, were the gravest threat to Russia and to the Tsar himself. To him, parliaments and constitutions were alien Western concepts that could only dismember the empire. At his side stood Interior Minister Dmitry Tolstoy, who shared the same disdain for Western institutions. A constitution, or representative assembly, Tolstoy argued, would open the door not to progress but to communism. Together, these men shaped an ironclad regime that sought to undo every trace of reform and silence every voice of dissent. Under Alexander's reign, autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism became the empire's holy trinity, and the prisons of Russia filled once more. The author of War and Peace, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, in a heartfelt letter, urged the Tsar to show compassion, to forgive the assassins of his father, arguing that violence could never cure violence, and that true strength lay in mercy. But Alexander III was in no mood for forgiveness. The captured conspirators were executed without delay, and a wave of harsh reprisals swept through the empire. The measures worked, at least on the surface. Narodnaya Volya began to crumble, its members hunted down or silenced. Those who had expected the Tsar's assassination to ignite a mass uprising were bitterly disappointed. The people, weary and frightened, remained silent. As the revolutionaries weakened, the regime only tightened its grip. Universities soon became another target. To the Tsar and his ministers, the lecture halls of Russia had turned into breeding grounds for sedition. Determined to bring education under total state control, the government began restricting admission for students from non-noble families. Tuition fees were raised sharply, effectively shutting the poor out of higher education. Even scholarships were rationed. Only 15% of students could study free of charge. When working-class families somehow managed to keep their children in school, the state struck again. Tuition was raised to 100 rubles per year. Secondary schools followed the same pattern. Step by step, the doors of learning were closed to the lower classes. Inside the universities, life was no better. Students were treated not as members of the academic community, but as outsiders on probation. One of the Tsar's most trusted officials, Alexander Polovtsov, wrote approvingly that the universities were full of bomb-throwing students and urged the Tsar to hold firm to his hard line. Even clothing became a matter of control. Throughout the 19th century, students had been required to wear distinctive uniforms that indicated not only their university, but even their faculty. A constant reminder that they were subjects of the state, not free citizens. The Tsar also directed his wrath toward the Jews. Across the empire, new restrictions barred them from owning land or settling freely in cities. In education, quotas limited Jewish enrollment, shutting thousands out of schools and universities. Among those affected was a bright young student from Kherson, Lev Davidovich Bronstein. His family's livelihood collapsed under the anti-Jewish laws, forcing him to move to Odessa to live with relatives. There, he struggled to prepare for his entrance exams, failing the first time because of the quotas, but succeeding a year later. The world would later know him by another name, Leon Trotsky, one of the future architects of the Russian Revolution. Like Lev Bronstein, the young Vladimir Ulyanov also grew up in conflict with the Tsarist regime. His older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, was already active in anti-autocratic student circles. In 1886, after police arrests followed a student demonstration, unrest flared again in Russia's universities. Divided into rival factions, the young revolutionaries disagreed on methods but shared one goal: the overthrow of autocracy. One faction, determined to carry on Narodnaya Volya's legacy of terror, decided to assassinate Tsar Alexander III himself. Their plan was simple and symbolic. On the 6th anniversary of Alexander II's assassination, they would throw a bomb at the Tsar's carriage during a memorial ceremony for his father. But the group's correspondence fell into the hands of the Okhrana, the Russian secret police. Suspicious of the letters, agents placed the conspirators under surveillance and soon caught them near Nevsky Prospect, armed with homemade dynamite bombs. Among them was the group's chief ideologue and bomb maker, Alexander Ulyanov. 10 of the accused begged the Tsar for mercy and were spared. Alexander and 4 others refused to ask for clemency, insisting that their actions were driven by principle. Tried and convicted for preparing explosives and writing the manifesto that would have been read after the Tsar's death, Alexander Ulyanov was sentenced to hang. His mother, Maria Ulyanova, devastated by her son's fate, managed after great effort to obtain permission to visit him in prison. She pleaded with Alexander to request a pardon. His reply was as calm as it was unyielding. "Mother, imagine two men dueling. One has already fired, the other has not. The man who has fired begs his opponent not to shoot. How could he possibly do that?" Under pressure from his family and weakened by despair, Alexander finally agreed to submit a formal appeal, but the Tsar refused it. On May 20th, 1887, Alexander Ulyanov was executed at Schlisselburg Fortress alongside his comrades. While revolutionary storms raged at home, Russia's foreign policy was entering turbulent waters. Tsar Alexander III despised France, viewing it as the cradle of anarchism and demagoguery. His first official trip abroad, to Germany, made his political orientation unmistakable. He replaced the elderly Prince Gorchakov, who had clashed with Bismarck, with Nikolai Gears, a diplomat known for his pro-German leanings. At first, relations between Berlin and St. Petersburg appeared steady. Treaties signed in 1884 and 1887 seemed to reaffirm the friendship between the two empires. But the partnership had lost its spirit. Russia's relations with Britain were tense in both the Balkans and the Far East, and its ties with France were still poisoned by ideological mistrust. A republic, in Russian eyes, could never be a reliable ally. Thus, Russia's position in Europe grew increasingly isolated, forcing it to rely on German goodwill. Bismarck, always the master strategist, worked to keep Russia on his side, offering concessions and crafting new alliances to maintain the delicate balance of power. Then came 1888, the year that changed everything. The death of Emperor Wilhelm I in March ended an era. On his deathbed, the old Kaiser urged his son to preserve the traditional friendship between the Hohenzollerns and the Romanovs, to keep the bond unbroken. But his successor, Frederick III, reigned for only 3 months before dying of cancer, leaving the throne to his ambitious young son Wilhelm II. Unlike his forebears, Wilhelm II had little regard for Bismarck's cautious diplomacy. The Chancellor's grand design had been to balance Austria and Russia, dividing the Balkans into respective spheres of influence to prevent conflict between them. The new Kaiser, however, saw the future not in balance but in dominance. Although he visited St. Petersburg early in his reign at Bismarck's urging, the Russians did not trust him. Wilhelm sought to replace the Russian connection with one to Britain, but London had no interest in jeopardizing its relations with France. Meanwhile, the young Kaiser dreamed of a global empire, a Weltpolitik, while Bismarck wanted to keep Germany focused on continental stability. Germany's booming industry and expanding economy gave Wilhelm the confidence to look beyond Europe. Hamburg had become one of the world's busiest ports. The nation's factories and shipyards demanded new markets and raw materials. Colonial ambition was no longer a dream but a necessity. And so, inevitably, German eyes turned toward the Ottoman Empire. In 1888, Deutsche Bank obtained the concession to build a railway in Anatolia from the Ottoman Empire. The first step toward the grand project later, known as the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. When Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Istanbul in November 1889, he made no secret of his admiration for the Sultan and his empire. For the Ottoman Empire, still reeling from the disaster of the 1877–78 war and diplomatically isolated, this German interest offered a glimmer of hope, a potential counterbalance to Russian power. But in St. Petersburg, the reaction was fury. To Russian eyes, the Kaiser's gestures toward the Sultan were nothing less than a betrayal. The message was unmistakable. Germany's era of friendship with Russia was ending. Tsar Alexander II of Russia had fallen victim to an assassination, and his brother-in-law, Emperor Wilhelm, had died at the age of 91. On the German throne now stood Wilhelm II, an expansionist monarch who championed pan-Germanism. In Russia ruled Alexander III, a staunch advocate of pan-Slavism and an ardent supporter of Russification. With Bismarck's resignation, all political authority naturally shifted to the Kaiser. Wilhelm II summoned the Russian ambassador and assured him that his foreign policy would not differ from that of his grandfather. Tsar Alexander's response was curt: "We shall see." It did not take long for him to be proven right. One of the first changes after Bismarck's departure took place in the foreign ministry. Fritz von Holstein became responsible for foreign affairs. Although he had served under Bismarck, Holstein lacked the Chancellor's grasp of international politics. He dismissed the possibility of a Franco-Russian alliance as pure fantasy and rejected Bismarck's policy of keeping Russia and Austria on the same side. According to the existing agreements, if Russia were to attack Austria, Germany was under no obligation to assist Vienna. At the same time, Berlin pledged to support Russia's ambitions in the Balkans and the Straits, in effect prioritizing Russia over Austria. Through the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887, Germany had made far-reaching commitments to Russia. If the treaty's secret clauses ever became public, Germany would find itself in a dangerous situation against Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and several other European powers. With pan-Slavist forces now guiding Russian policy, the treaty gave the Tsar's empire a powerful diplomatic weapon. All of this convinced the new German administration not to renew the agreement with Russia. When Alexander III learned of this decision, he responded calmly but pointedly. Bismarck was right when he said that the day he left office, the foreign policy of the German Empire would change as well. A German newspaper of the time summarized the new course with these words: "On this new path, Germany will remain tied to Austria, but it may have to pay for Vienna's Balkan policy with its own blood and prosperity." Wilhelm's determination to disrupt the existing balance and reshape European politics pushed Russia back into isolation. The Tsar returned to his earlier conviction. To survive, Russia needed a counterweight to the growing pan-German bloc. In line with his Russification policy, Alexander III issued a decree in May 1887 prohibiting foreigners from owning land in Western Russia, a move indirectly aimed at the region's German landowners. The decision sparked a strong reaction in Germany. A campaign against the Russian economy began, and Russian securities on the Berlin Stock Exchange plunged in value. In response, the Reichsbank announced that Russian bonds would no longer be accepted as collateral, effectively cutting Russia off from its main source of foreign credit. As economic separation deepened, military estrangement followed. The growing mistrust between the two empires prompted mutual rearmament. Russia viewed Germany's military expansion as a direct threat and began its own preparations for a potential future conflict. The most urgent need was the development of railways, essential for mobilizing troops across the vast empire. But railways required immense capital. It was France that seized this opportunity. Still haunted by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, France had long yearned for an alliance with Russia. The isolation of St. Petersburg offered the perfect opening. French investors, withdrawing their funds from troubled ventures in Italy, turned to Russia, purchasing 500 million francs in Russian bonds. Soon after, Russia secured nearly 2 billion francs in loans on the Paris Stock Exchange. Thus, the first step toward the Franco-Russian rapprochement was not political, but economic. Yet despite everything, the Tsar remained hesitant to align himself with France. Alexander did not wish to break away from Germany. Early 1891, he made one final attempt to renew the treaty between the two empires. When Berlin once again rejected the proposal, Russia found itself with no alternative. The Russian government could no longer stand idle while the members of the Triple Alliance openly armed themselves against it. Circumstances now made a Franco-Russian alliance inevitable. In 1892, the two nations' general staffs signed a military convention pledging mutual assistance in the event of a German attack. Soon after, this military understanding was followed by a formal political alliance between the two governments. Thus, by 1894, the first pillar of the Triple Entente had been formed. Until that point, La Marseillaise, the anthem of the French Revolution, had been strictly forbidden in Russia. But the times had changed. When French officials arrived on Russian soil, they were greeted with their national anthem, and the Tsar respectfully removed his hat while the march was being played. St. Petersburg and Paris were now allies, bound together by circumstance as much as by intent. Still, Alexander III remained deeply skeptical of foreign powers. «В этом мире у нас есть только два надежных союзника. Наша армия и наш флот», he once said, and devoted himself to strengthening both. Russia embarked on an ambitious program of industrialization and railway construction in an effort to catch up with its Western counterparts. But modernization brought unintended consequences: urbanization, rising literacy, and the growing influence of the press. Industrial progress demanded political reform, for a society newly exposed to the world now sought institutions through which it could express its grievances. Yet the Tsar believed that, so long as there was no organized opposition, the peasantry would remain loyal to him. He still sought to rule this vast empire as his ancestors had, autocratically and without sharing power. But such a system could not endure. The famine of 1891 would expose the deep flaws of his regime to both the Russian people and the outside world. The harsh winter of 1890 was followed by a severe drought the next summer, and Russia was soon gripped by one of the worst famines in its history. Cries for help rose from the provinces, but reached St. Petersburg only with great delay. The government's inefficiency became painfully clear. Poor railway infrastructure hindered the transport of aid, and even more disastrously, rivalries among ministries paralyzed relief efforts. Finance Minister Ivan Vishnegradsky clashed bitterly with Minister of Transport Konstantin Zhubeny, leading to the latter's resignation. To coordinate the response, a special committee was formed under the direction of the Tsar's son, Tsarevich Nicholas. The young heir thus gained his first-hand experience of his country's suffering. Even the staunch autocrat Konstantin Pobedonostsev grew alarmed, warning the Tsar in a letter that Russia's enemies, socialists and anarchists, will seize upon the famine to incite the people. Volunteers wishing to distribute aid were required to obtain permission from local governors, for the authorities feared that revolutionaries might exploit the crisis. The hysteria touched even Leo Tolstoy, who took part in relief efforts and wrote an article titled "On the Famine to Raise Awareness," only for it to be banned by censors. The Zemstvos, local councils established under Alexander II, had by now been stripped of most of their powers. In many cities, chaos reigned. It was often unclear whether supplies ever reached those in need. Famine was soon followed by epidemic disease, spreading death on an unprecedented scale. The Russian people now reaped the bitter fruit of Vishnegradsky's infamous declaration: "We shall eat less, we shall starve, but we shall export." The twin disasters of 1891 to 1892 claimed over 400,000 lives. For the first time, the Russian populace turned against the government in large numbers, and the seeds of organized opposition began to sprout. From the day he ascended the throne in 1881, Alexander III sought to consolidate autocracy, suppress dissent, and eliminate foreign influence in Russia. His policies of Russification imposed restrictions on Jews and other minorities, while his government pursued industrial and railway expansion to modernize the empire. One such railway project would nearly cost him his life, and mark a turning point in Russian history. In October 1888, a train carrying the Tsar and his family from Crimea to St. Petersburg derailed near Kharkov. Their carriage was crushed, but the physically imposing Tsar was said to have held up the roof beams long enough for his family, including the future Tsar Nicholas II, to escape. Though he survived with only minor injuries, the incident left a lasting impression. The man who had warned him about excessive speed, Sergei Witte, was soon appointed director of Imperial Railways and would later become the first Prime Minister of Russia. To the outside world, the Tsar appeared vigorous and unshakable. But by 1894, he had fallen gravely ill with nephritis. As his condition worsened, rumors spread throughout Europe. Hoping the milder climate would help, he was moved to Crimea, but his health continued to decline. On November 1st, 1894, Alexander III died in the arms of his wife. Beside them stood his 26-year-old son Nicholas, who had dreamed of learning the art of government from his father, but instead found himself burdened overnight with the rule of a vast empire. Overwhelmed, he confided in his cousin, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich. «Алекс, я не готов быть царем. Что мне делать? Что станет со мной и с Россией?» It was a haunting foreshadowing of the tragedy to come.